Had a few minutes before been a battlefield now became a confusion. The Wargo army, released in an instant from Morgoth's mind control, now milled mindlessly about, waiting for some force to tell them what to do next. All sense of aggression had left them, and most of them simply dropped their weapons and wandered off. Others sat down and sang quietly to themselves. Without Morgoth's direction, they were like little children. The group, struggling to escape up 3 paths, now stood mute and unmoving, waiting patiently for those at the front to clear the way. Duncan surveyed the scene in bewilderment. "We'll need an army of sheepdogs to round up the slot," he said to Baron Harold, and his counsellor smiled in reply. "Better that than what we faced, my lord," he said, and Duncan had to agree. The small inner circle of Morgoth's lieutenants were a different matter. Some had been captured, but others had fled into the wastelands of the fens. Crowley, the Ranger Corps commander, shook his head as he realized that he and his men faced many long, hard days in the saddle after this. He would have to assign a ranger task force to hunt down Morgoth's lieutenants and bring them back to face the king's justice. It was always this way, he thought wryly. While everyone else could sit back and relax, the ranger work continued non-stop. Horace, bruised, battered, and bleeding, had been taken to the king's own tent for treatment. He was badly injured after his insane leap under the battlemaster's hooves. There were several broken bones, and he was bleeding from one ear, but amazingly none of the injuries were critical, and the king's own healer, who had examined him immediately, was confident that he would make a full recovery. Sir Rodney had hurried up to the litter at the bearers were preparing to carry the boy off the field. His moustache bristled with fury as he stood over his apprentice. "What the hell did you think you were doing?" he roared, and Horace winced. "Who told you to challenge Morgoth? You're nothing but an apprentice boy, and a damn disobedient one at that." Horace wondered if the shouting was going to continue for much longer. If it were, he could almost wish to be back facing Morgoth. He was dazed and sick and dizzy, and Sir Rodney's angry red face swam in and out of focus in front of him. The battlemaster's words seemed to bounce from one side of his skull to the other side and back again, and he wasn't sure why he was yelling so much. Maybe Morgoth was still alive, he thought groggily, and as the thought struck him, he tried to get up. Instantly Rodney's glare faded and his expression changed to one of concern. He gently stopped the wounded apprentice from rising. Then he reached down and gripped the boy's hand in a firm grasp. "Rest, boy," he said. "You've done enough today. You've done well." Meanwhile, Holt shoved his way through the harmless wargles. They gave way without any resistance or resentment as he searched desperately for Will, but there was no sign of the boy nor of the king's daughter. Once they had heard Morgoth's taunt, they had realized that if Will were still alive, there was a chance that Cassandra, as Evelyn was really called, might have survived as well. The fact that Morgoth hadn't mentioned her indicated that her identity had remained a secret. This, of course, Holt realized, was why she had assumed her maid's name. By doing so, she preserved Morgoth's knowing what a potential lever he had in his hands. He pushed impatiently through another group of silent wargles, then stopped as he heard a weak cry from one side. A Canadian barely alive was sitting leaning against the bole of a tree. He had slumped down, his legs stretched straight in front of him in the dust, his head lolling weakly to one side. A huge stain of blood marked the side of his sheepskin vest. A heavy sword lay beside him, his hand too weak to hold it any longer. He made a feeble, scrambling gesture towards it, and his eyes beseeched Holt to help him. Norled, growing weaker by the moment, had allowed his grasp on the sword to release. Now weak and almost blinded, he couldn't find it, and he knew he was close to death. Holt knelt beside him. He could see there was no potential danger in the man. He was too far gone for any treachery. He took the sword and placed it in the man's lap, putting his hands on the leather-bound hilt. "Thanks, friend," Nola gasped weakly. Holt nodded sadly. He admires the Canadians as warriors, and it bothered him to see one laid as low as this, so weak that he couldn't maintain his grip on his sword. The ranger knew what that meant to the sea riders. He rose slowly and began to turn away, then stopped. Horace had said that Will and Evelyn had been taken by a small party of Canadians. Maybe this man knew something. He dropped to one knee again and put a hand on the man's face, turning it towards his own. "The boy," he said urgently, knowing he had only a few minutes. "Where is he?" Norlid frowned. The words struck a chord in his memory, but everything that had ever happened to him seemed such a long time ago and somehow unimportant. "Boy," he repeated quietly, and Holt couldn't help himself. He shook the dying man. "Will," he said, his face only a few centimeters from the orders. "A ranger, a boy, where is he?" A small light of understanding and memory burned in Norlid's eye. Now, as he recalled the boy, he'd admired his courage, he remembered, admired the way the boy had stood them off at their bridge. Without realizing it, he actually said the last 3 words. "At the bridge," he whispered, and Jog shook him again. "Yes, the boy at the bridge. Where is he?" Norlid looked up at him. There was something he had to remember. He knew it was important to this grim-faced stranger, and he wanted to help. After all, the stranger had helped him find his sword again. He remembered what it was. "Gone," he managed finally. He wished the strength wouldn't shake him. It caused him no pain at all because he couldn't feel anything, but it kept waking him from his warm, soft sleep he was drifting into. The bearded face was a long way from his own, at the end of a tunnel. The voice echoed down the tunnel to him. "Gone where?" He listened to the echo. He liked the echo. It reminded him of something from his childhood. Where? The echo came again, and now he remembered. "The fens," he said. "Through the fens to the ships." He smiled when he said it. He'd wanted to help the stranger, and he had. And this time, when the warm softness crept over him, the stranger didn't shake him. He was glad about that. Holt stood up from the body of Norlid. "Thank you, friend," he said simply. Then he ran to where he'd left Albert gazing quietly and vaulted into the saddle. The fens were a tangle of head-high grasses, swamps, and winding passages of clear water. To most people, they were impassable. An incautious step could lead to a person sinking quickly into the oozing mine of quicksand that lurked on every side. Once in the featureless marshes, it was easy to become hopelessly lost and to wander until exhaustion overcame you. Or the venomous water snakes that thrived here found you unawares. Wise people avoided the fens. Only two groups knew the secret paths through them, the Rangers and the Canadians, who had been raiding along this coastline for as long as Holt could remember. Sure-footed as Ranger horses were, once Holt was truly into the tangle of tall grass and swampland, he dismounted and led Albert. The signs of the safe path were minute and easy to miss, and he needed to be close to the ground to follow them. He hadn't been traveling long when he began to see signs that a party had come before him, and his spirit lifted. It had to be the rest of the Canadians with with Will and Evelyn. He quickened his pace and promptly paid the consequence for doing so, missing a path marking and ending chest-deep in a thick mass of bottomless mud. Fortunately, he still had a firm grip on Albert's rein, and at a word of command, the stocky horse dragged him clear of the danger. It was another good reason to continue leading the horse behind him, he realized. He backtracked to the path, found his bearings, and set out again. In spite of his seething impatience, he forced himself to go carefully. The marks left by the party in front of him were becoming more and more recent. He knew he was catching them. The question was whether he would catch them in time. mosquitus and mosquitoes, and marsh flies hummed and whizzed around him. Without a breath or breeze, it was definitely hot in the marshes, and he was sweating freely. His clothes were soaked and sodden with stinking mud, and he'd lost one boot as Albert had hauled him out of the quicksand. Nevertheless, he limped on, coming closer and closer to his quarry with every sodden step. Yeah. At the same time, he knew he was coming closer and closer to the end of the Fenlands, and that meant the beach where the Scandinavian ships lay at anchor. He had to find Will before the Scandinavians reached the beach. Once Will was on one of their full ships, he would be gone forever, taken back across the stormwater sea to the cold, snowbound land of the Scandinavians, where he would be sold as a slave, to lead a life of drudgery and numbing and unending labor. Now, above the rotting smell of the marshes, he caught the fresh scent of salt air. He was close to the sea. He doubled his efforts, throwing caution to the wind as he chanced everything to catch up with the Canadians before they reached the water. The grass was thinning in front of him now, and the ground beneath his feet became firmer with every step. He was running, the horses trotting behind him, and he burst clear into the windswept length of the beach. A small ridge in the dunes in front of him blocked the sea from his sight, and he swung up into Albert's saddle on the run and set the horses to a gallop. They swept over the ridge, the ranger leaning forward, low on his horse's neck, urging him to greater speed. There was a wolf ship anchored offshore. At the water's edge, a group of people were boarding a small boat, and even at this distance, Holt recognized a small figure as the middle as his apprentice. "Will," he shouted, but the sea wind snatched the words away. What? With hands and knees, he urged Albert onward. It was the drumming of hooves that alerted them. Eric waist deep in water as he and Horak shoved the boat into the deeper water, looked over his shoulder, and saw the green and grey cloaked figure on the shaggy horse. Hegel Beard, he shouted. "Get moving, Will. Get moving." Will, seated beside Evelyn in the center of the boat, turned as he spoke and saw Holt, barely 200 meters away. He stood precariously, trying to keep his balance in the heaving boat. "Holt!" he yelled, and instantly Svengel's backhanded blow sent him sprawling into the bottom of the little cart. "Stay down," he ordered, as Eric and Horak vaulted into the boat, and the rowers sent it surging into the first line of waves. The wind, which had stopped them hearing Holt's cry, carried the boy's thin shout to Holt's ears. Albert heard it too, and found a few more yards of pace, his muscles gathering underneath him and sending him along in huge bounds. Holt was riding without reins now as he unslung the long bow and laid an arrow on the string. At a full gallop he sighted and released. The bow oarsman gave a grunt of surprise and lurched sideways over the gauntway of the boat as Holt's heavy arrow slammed into him, transfixing his upper arm. The boat began to crab sideways, and Eric dashed forward, shoved the man aside, and took over the oar. "Pull like hell," he ordered them. "If he gets too close range, we'll all be dead men." Now Holt guided Albert with his knees, swinging the horse into the sea itself and thrusting forward to try and catch the boat. He fired again, but the range was extreme, and the target was heaving and tossing on the waves. Added to that was the fact that Holt couldn't shoot near to the center of the boat for fear of hitting Will or Evelyn. His best chance was to get close enough for easy shooting and pick off the oarsmen one at a time. He fired again. The arrow bit deep into the timbers of the boat, barely an inch from Horak's hand. In the stern, he jerked his hand away as if he'd been burnt and yelped in surprise, then flinched as another arrow hissed into the water behind the boat, not a foot away. But now the boat was gaining as Albert breast deep in the waves, could no longer maintain his speed. The little horses thrust valiantly against the water, but the boat was drawing alongshore the wolf ship and was still over 100 meters away. Holt urged the horse a few meters closer, then stopped, defeated, as he saw the figures behind hauled up from the boat. The two smaller passengers were led to the stern steering position. The Canadian crew lined the sides of the ship, standing on the rail to shout their defiance at the small figure who was almost obscured by the rolling ferry waves. On the bullship, Eric yelled at them, diving for cover behind the solid bones. "Get down, you fools! That's a ranger!" He'd seen Holt bow coming up, then saw his hands move at incredible speed. His remaining 9 arrows were arcing high in the air before the first one struck, within the space of 2 seconds. 3 of the Canadians lining the rail went down under the arrow storm. 2 of them lay groaning in pain. The other was ominously still. The rest of the crew flung themselves flat on the deck as arrows hissed and thundered around them. Cautiously, Eric raised his head above the brawling, making sure that Holt was out of arrows. "Get under way," he ordered, and took the steering oar. Will, temporarily forgotten, moved to the rail. It was only a few 100 meters, and nobody was watching him. He could swim that far, he knew, and he began to reach for the railing. Then he hesitated, thinking of Evelyn. He knew he couldn't abandon her. Even as he had the thought, Harrick's big hand closed over the collar of his jacket, and the chance was gone. As the ship began to gather way, Will stared at the mountain figure in the surf, buffeted by the waves. Holt was so near and yet so impossibly out of reach. His eyes stung with tears, and faintly he heard Holt's voice. "Will, stay alive. Don't give up. I'll find you wherever they take you." Choking on tears, the boy raised his arm in farewell to his friend and mentor. "Holt," he croaked, but he knew the ranger would never hear him. He heard the voice again, carrying over the sounds of winds, and it says, "I'll find you, Will." Then the wind filled the big square sail of the wolf ship, and she heeled away from the shore, moving faster and faster towards the northeast. For a long time after she dropped below the horizon, the sodden figure sat there, his horse chest deep in billowing water, staring after the ship, and his lips still moved in a silent promise only he could hear. Okay, well, that was a bit sad, but thank you for listening to me read chapter 36, I suppose. I think that's the end. Yeah. And then this is the next book which we will read. I'd like to thank you very much for listening, and I will see you next time. Thank you. Bye-bye.